There's a peculiar kind of injustice that doesn't announce itself with fanfare. It arrives quietly, in the margins, easily overlooked by those focused on the headline. On August 7, 1943, Major General Terry Allen received orders to report to Second Corps headquarters in Sicily. The conversation that followed would last only minutes, but those minutes would fundamentally alter the trajectory of his career and raise questions about military leadership that historians still debate today. 2 days later, on August 9th, Terry Allen's face appeared on the cover of Time magazine. The article inside praised him as one of America's finest division commanders in the making. A hero, the magazine proclaimed, a leader whose personal luster was growing with each victory. There was just one problem. By the time that magazine hit newsstands across the country, Terry Allen was already unemployed, cast aside by the man who had fired him, sailing home in disgrace while Americans celebrated his accomplishments. His name was Omar Bradley, and he had just made one of the most controversial personnel decisions of the entire war. This is the story of how two of the most talented military leaders in American history collided over fundamentally different philosophies of command. It's a story about combat effectiveness versus military discipline, about individual brilliance versus institutional conformity, and about how even victorious commanders can make decisions that will haunt them. Most importantly, it's a story about redemption, because Terry Allen refused to accept that his career was finished. What Bradley meant as a final judgment, George Marshall would transform into a second chance. Part 1. The man Bradley didn't understand to understand how Terry Allen became the target of Omar Bradley's disdain. We have to go back to a peculiar American, a man who failed at the very institution designed to produce officers, yet somehow became one of the finest combat commanders the nation ever produced. Terry de la Mesa Allen was born on April 1, 1888 in Fort Douglas, Utah, to a family with deep military roots. His father was an Army colonel, and his maternal grandfather had fought at Gettysburg in the Civil War, serving in the Garibaldi Guard, that famous unit of immigrant soldiers who believed in freedom so much they crossed an ocean to fight for it. 4 generations of Allen's family had worn the uniform before him. The expectations were clear. Terry Allen would be a soldier. The problem began almost immediately. When Allen arrived at West Point in 1905, he carried with him something his father's commission and his grandfather's legacy couldn't compensate for. He had severe dyslexia. Reading was an ordeal, a battle against text that seemed to resist his comprehension. In an institution built on the mastery of printed regulations and military manuals, Allen struggled. He compensated by developing an extraordinary memory, memorizing entire passages and procedures. But the academic work remained a constant ordeal. Allen failed out of West Point not once, but twice. After his second expulsion, most men would have accepted the verdict. The academy had spoken. The Army didn't want them. Find another career. Move on with your life. But Terry Allen was not most men. He wasn't just stubborn, though he was that. He was driven by something deeper, a calling to military service that no bureaucratic rejection could extinguish. He enrolled at Catholic University in Washington and completed the Reserve Officer Training Corps program there. In 1912, he entered the Army as a commissioned officer, and it was through this back door that the future legend gained his place in the service. The regular Army officers, those gentlemen who had graduated from West Point through the proper channels, looked down on him. He wasn't one of them. He hadn't earned his commission the accepted way. But Allen didn't care what they thought. He was exactly where he wanted to be. He had 30 years to prove that West Point grades meant nothing when bullets started flying. The Great War came to America in 1917, and it revealed who Terry Allen truly was. Assigned to the 90th Division as a battalion commander, he demonstrated a style of leadership that would become his signature throughout his career. At age 30, commanding an infantry battalion, Allen made decisions that infuriated his superiors and inspired his men. He personally led patrols into no man's land, actions that regulations specifically forbade for officers of his rank. Battalion commanders were supposed to stay behind the lines, coordinating operations from relative safety. Allen couldn't tolerate that separation from his men. He needed to see the ground, feel the danger, understand the threat firsthand. during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, the largest battle in American military history to that point. Allen distinguished himself in ways that would become legendary among enlisted men. A machine gun bullet tore through his jaw during the Meuse offensive. The wound was serious. Army doctors advised evacuation, hospital recovery, a safe assignment in the rear. Allen talked them into sending him back to his unit while the wound was still bleeding. He showed up at the front line, jaw wrapped, leaving a trail of blood as he moved through his men's positions. They didn't know whether to be inspired or horrified. They settled on both. His superiors found him infuriating. He drank too much. He ignored regulations he considered stupid wastes of time. He treated military ceremony not as a foundation for discipline, but as an obstacle to training. He questioned orders he disagreed with and pushed back on decisions he thought endangered his men unnecessarily. But he won. Every single engagement his battalion fought ended in American victory. The casualty rate in his unit was lower than units with more cautious commanders. He kept his men alive through aggressive tactics and personal leadership that made them believe they could accomplish anything under his command. After the armistice, Allen returned to the peacetime army, and this is where his story becomes almost comedic in its frustration. He bounced between cavalry posts, got into trouble, got out of trouble, and built a reputation as the officer you wanted in a fight and nowhere else. He accumulated debt. He struggled with the bureaucratic aspects of military life. He clashed with superiors who cared more about spit and polish than combat readiness. The peacetime army of the 1920s and 1930s had no use for men like Terry Allen. Then George Marshall noticed him. By 1940, Marshall was Chief of Staff of the Army, the man responsible for rebuilding the American military for the war he knew was coming. Marshall didn't think like other senior commanders. While they concerned themselves with West point pedigrees and academy credentials, Marshall looked for fighting spirit, for men who understood that wars were won by soldiers willing to follow their commanders into hell, not soldiers who could march in straight lines. In 1940, Terry Allen, then a lieutenant colonel facing possible court-martial for yet another incident, received a telegram. He had been promoted to brigadier general, skipping the permanent rank of colonel entirely. George Marshall had personally intervened. Other generals thought Marshall had lost his mind. Allen was a drunk, they said, a troublemaker, a man who had failed out of West Point twice. What did Marshall see that they didn't? The answer was elegant in its simplicity. Marshall saw a man who understood that wars were won in the minds and hearts of soldiers, not in the pages of regulations. He saw a man who would push his unit to achieve things everyone else thought impossible. In May of 1942, Marshall gave Allen command of the 1st Infantry Division, the Big Red one of the most coveted assignments in the entire Army. It was a decision that would prove prescient and controversial in equal measure. Allen was about to meet the man who would try to destroy his career. Part 2. The Collision of Two Philosophies. Major General Omar Bradley was everything Terry Allen was not. Bradley had graduated from West Point. He was methodical, careful, meticulous, and obsessed with proper military procedure. He believed that discipline and order were the foundations of an effective fighting force. To Bradley, regulations weren't obstacles to be negotiated. They were the architecture upon which military effectiveness was built. A soldier who wouldn't salute properly was a soldier whose reliability was in question. A unit with slovenly uniforms was a unit with slovenly fighting practices. The exterior and the interior were inseparable, in Bradley's view, and you could not have one without the other. When Bradley took command of 2nd Corps in North Africa, he inherited Allen's 1st Infantry Division. What he saw appalled him. The soldiers of the Big Red One didn't salute with precision. Their uniforms were dirty, worn from combat rather than crisp from a press. They brawled in rear-area towns, treating military police as enemies rather than authority figures. They had, in Bradley's own words, left a trail of looted wine shops and outraged mayors across North Africa. Allen's men had celebrated their combat victories in ways that completely violated military protocol. Bradley, newly promoted and eager to establish his authority, decided that the problem with the 1st Division wasn't its combat performance. The problem was its commander. The problem was Terry Allen and his casual disregard for the things Bradley held sacred. Yet here's where the story becomes complicated, because Bradley, even as he criticized Allen, had to admit something. When Second Corps had faced the German 10th Panzer, division at El Guitar, when American units across the Corps had been shattered and fragmented, Allen's 1st Division held. When desperate counterattacks came, it was Allen's men who led the assault. When the Germans threatened to break through American lines and push back the invasion, it was Allen's division that stopped them cold. Bradley later wrote something he clearly regretted, something that escaped his careful control even as he worked to remove Allen from command. Bradley wrote that no division commander excelled Terry Allen in the leadership of troops. He wrote it through gritted teeth. Think about what he was really saying. Allen was the best combat leader in the entire Second Corps. His men would follow him anywhere. His tactical innovations worked. His aggressiveness achieved victory with lower casualty rates than more cautious commanders achieved. But his men didn't salute properly. And, to Omar Bradley, in that moment of his military maturity, that mattered more than winning battles. Yet there was something else happening, something that extended beyond Bradley's personal distaste for Allen's style. While Bradley was struggling to reshape the 1st Division to meet his standards of military discipline, Allen was learning something in the desert of North Africa that would define the rest of his career. He was discovering night warfare. During the day, the equation in North Africa was straightforward and brutally unfair. German artillery and machine guns turned every American advance into a bloodbath. Troops had to cross open ground against defenders who could see every movement, who had prepared fields of fire, who had calculated distances with mathematical precision. Casualties mounted, progress slowed. The attrition was unsustainable, but at night, the equation changed. German gunners couldn't hit what they couldn't see. American infantry could close the distance before defenders knew they were coming. German artillery became less effective, less accurate. The darkness was an equalizer, a tool that transformed American aggressiveness from a liability into an advantage. Allen began experimenting with night operations in the 1st Division, not the standard 8 to 12 hours per week that Army regulations recommended as sufficient training. Allen pushed his men towards something radical for the time: 30 to 35 hours of night training per week. His soldiers moved in complete darkness, learning to navigate by compass and stars. They rehearsed attacks until they could execute them without speaking, until hand signals and muscle memory replaced shouted orders. Officers learned how to lead men they couldn't see clearly. Enlisted men learned how to move as coordinated units when visibility was nearly non-existent. The results were immediate and striking. At El Guitar, Allen's night assaults caught German units completely off guard. The 10th Panzer Division was forced to withdraw after taking heavy casualties. Prisoners, interrogated after the battle, reported confusion, disorientation, and inability to organize effective resistance against enemies they couldn't see coming. Bradley watched Allen's victories pile up. The discipline problems continued, and so did Bradley's determination to do something about them. In July of 1943, the Allies invaded Sicily. George Patton commanded the American 7th Army. Bernard Montgomery commanded the British 8th Army. Patton, with his flamboyant style and aggressive tactics, actually understood what Allen was doing. Patton appreciated combat effectiveness above all else. When Patton specifically requested the 1st Division for the most difficult landing at Gila, it wasn't because he thought they would impress observers or march in pretty formations. He requested them because he knew Allen's men could handle the hardest fighting. The 1st Division landed on July 10th. Within hours, German forces from the Hermann Göring Division counterattacked, with 90 tanks, attempting to push the Americans back into the sea. Allen's division stopped them. Later, Bradley would make an extraordinary admission. He would question whether any other division could have repelled that charge in time to save the invasion. Any other division. Not just Bradley's words, but his unspoken acknowledgement that Allen's division might have been the only unit in the entire invasion force capable of saving the entire Sicilian campaign. That's what Bradley said about the man he was about to fire. But Allen wasn't satisfied with merely holding the beach. He pushed inland aggressively, cracking the German defensive center and allowing Patton's army to race across Sicily toward Messina. His troops were exhausted. The island's interior was brutal, The fighting intense, the casualties mounting steadily. Allen drove them harder. On August 6th, after 6 days of brutal fighting, Allen's division captured the town of Troia. It was one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire Sicilian campaign. The objective had been achieved at tremendous cost, but achieved nonetheless. The victory at Troia should have been Allen's crowning moment. The capstone to his Sicilian campaign, proof that his methods worked, that aggressive leadership under his command could achieve objectives other divisions couldn't touch. Instead, on August 7, 1943, it became his curtain call. Part 3. The Firing. Terry Allen received orders to report to Second Corps headquarters. Bradley was waiting for him, and their conversation was brief. Allen was relieved of command of the 1st Infantry Division. His assistant division commander, Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., son of the former president, was also relieved. The official reason cited was discipline problems. Bradley said Allen had become too much of an individualist, too unwilling to submerge himself in the group undertakings of war. Allen was stunned. His division had just captured Troia. They had won every major engagement in North Africa and Sicily. They were the most celebrated division in the American Army. And now he was being sent home for not making his men salute properly. The injustice of it seared into him. He didn't know that Time magazine had already sent their August 9th issue to print with his face on the cover. While he sailed home in disgrace, American newsstands would celebrate him as one of the Army's best combat leaders. The timing was brutally, perfectly wrong. Bradley fires the guy on August 7th. Time magazine hits newsstands on August 9th with Allen on the cover. Bradley had just relieved the general America was calling a hero. George Patton was absolutely furious when he learned what Bradley had done. Patton and Allen had argued constantly. They insulted each other over tactics and leadership styles. They disagreed about strategy. They were not friends. But Patton recognized what Allen had built. More importantly, Patton had no patience for generals who cared more about salutes than victories. When Eisenhower gave a lecture criticizing the poor discipline of Allen's division, Patton interrupted him in front of the entire staff. He told Eisenhower that he was mistaken and offered an observation that would echo through military history. "No one whips a dog before putting him in a fight," Patton said. It didn't matter. Eisenhower backed Bradley's decision. The word was out. Allen was finished. His career was over. The man who had failed out of West Point twice had failed again, this time at the highest levels of military command. The men of the 1st Division took the news hard. They weren't just losing a general. They were losing the man who had eaten in their mess lines and walked their perimeter wires at night. Allen had known his soldiers as individuals. He had fought beside them, suffered with them, pushed them, and been pushed by them in return. They loved him in the way soldiers love officers who demonstrate that their lives matter more than regulation. Allen boarded a transport ship back to the United States. At 55 years old, the Army had told him he was obsolete. He didn't know that George Marshall was watching. He didn't know that the same man who had promoted him to general in 1940 was about to do something extraordinary. Part 4. The Second Chance. October 15th, 1943. Terry Allen stood before a formation of soldiers at Camp Adair, Oregon. These weren't the battle-hardened veterans of the Big Red One. These were draftees and recent enlistees who had never heard a shot fired in anger. Green troops, many of them nervous, uncertain, wondering if they had what it took to survive in combat. The 104th Infantry Division, nicknamed the Timberwolves. George Marshall had intervened again. Just 2 months after Bradley declared Allen unfit to command, Marshall gave him another division. 2 months. Think about the political implications of that decision. Bradley fires the guy, and Marshall hands him another division before the paperwork is dry. Marshall's message was unmistakable. He didn't care what Bradley thought. He didn't need a diplomat. He needed a brawler, a leader who understood how to take green troops and transform them into a fighting force that could achieve things other divisions couldn't accomplish. Allen looked at the raw troops in front of him and saw potential. He would build this division from nothing. These were young men, many of them frightened, all of them untested. But they were his to shape, his to train, his to mold into the most effective fighting unit possible. And he was going to prove that Omar Bradley had made the worst personnel decision of the entire war. The training that followed was unlike anything the 104th had experienced under their previous commander, Gilbert Cook. Allen immediately implemented the training regimen he had perfected in North Africa. But the 104th wasn't starting from a foundation of combat experience like the 1st Division had. They were starting from nothing. Allen was creating an entirely new approach to night warfare from the ground up. While standard divisions trained for daylight operations, the Timberwolves lived in the dark. They learned to move without flashlights, to navigate by compass and stars, to use hand signals and silent communication. They practiced attacks until every soldier knew exactly where to be without being told. Officers learned how to lead men they couldn't see. Soldiers learned how to maintain unit cohesion in complete darkness. Allen was ruthless about discipline. The paradox was striking. Here was the man Bradley had fired for insufficient discipline, now implementing a training regimen so demanding, so exacting, that soldiers were pushed to the breaking point. But this wasn't the casual discipline of salutes and parade ground formations. This was the discipline of survival, the discipline that said, if you don't understand your role perfectly, if you don't execute your movements exactly, you die, and your buddy dies, and the mission fails. Every successful night drill was a silent rebuke to the superiors who said he was undisciplined. Allen was forging the Timberwolves into a weapon that Omar Bradley would eventually have to respect. Soldiers who had never heard of Terry Allen before they arrived at Camp Adair began to understand something. This general was different. He asked impossible things of them, but he stood beside them as they accomplished those impossible things. He knew them. He cared about them. He pushed them to be better than they thought they could be. The Timberwolves adopted a motto: nothing in hell must stop the Timberwolves. It wasn't just something to say. It was becoming who they were. By August 1944, they were ready. Allen loaded his division onto transport ships bound for France. He was going back to war. The army that had told him he was washed up, that his style was obsolete, that he was too much of an individual, was about to witness what George Marshall already knew. Terry Allen was just getting started. Part 5. The 104th becomes legendary. The 104th Division entered combat on October 23, 1944, in the Netherlands. Allen attacked at night. His Timberwolves advanced 15 miles in 5 days through flooded lands that stalled other divisions. British commanders sent congratulations. Field Marshal Montgomery himself noted their progress. The division was working exactly as Allen had intended. They were becoming unstoppable. Then they hit the Siegfried Line, concrete pillboxes, anti-tank obstacles, interlocking fields of fire. Other divisions had bled themselves white attempting to assault these fortifications in daylight. German defenders had prepared the positions with mathematical precision, calculating fields of fire, creating kill zones, establishing overlapping defensive positions that American soldiers could only assail at tremendous cost. Allen's men attacked at night, again and again. Stolberg fell, then Eschweiler, then Inden. Town after town captured in darkness, while German defenders struggled to organize resistance against enemies they couldn't see coming. They smashed across the Roer River in a brutal night assault, and finally they reached Cologne. The Germans were calling them the Night Fighters. Prisoners captured during the campaign told interrogators that fighting the 104th was unfair. You couldn't see the Americans coming. The normal rules of warfare didn't seem to apply. By spring 1945, Allen's division had crossed the Rhine and was racing toward the Elbe River. They had become exactly what Allen had promised George Marshall: the most feared night-fighting unit in the European theater. German prisoners consistently rated the 104th among the American divisions they least wanted to face. They had learned through painful experience that the Timberwolves would appear from the darkness, would strike with devastating precision, would consolidate ground, and hold it against counterattacks. The division was moving so fast, achieving so much, that the end of the war caught them on the road. Allen's Timberwolves fought for 195 consecutive days without yielding ground to a German counterattack. Not once, never failed to take an objective. The division that had been handed to Terry Allen as a consolation prize, a unit of green draftees far removed from the battle-hardened Big Red One, had become one of the most effective fighting units in the entire European war. But on April 11, 1945, Allen's division reached a place that no amount of training, no amount of tactical innovation, no amount of combat readiness could have prepared them for. Part 6. The Darkness That Wasn't. The 104th Infantry Division reached Nordhausen in central Germany. German forces had been fleeing eastward for weeks, the Reich collapsing, the war clearly in its final days. The town itself wasn't heavily defended. The Timberwolves secured it quickly, efficiently, as they had secured dozens of other objectives. But as they moved through the town, soldiers began to notice something: an enormous underground complex, tunnels leading deep into the earth. Facilities that seemed designed for something other than normal military operations. The division commander ordered an investigation. What they found was beyond comprehension. They had liberated the Dora Mittelbau concentration camp. 3,000 corpses lay scattered across the grounds. Another 750 survivors, emaciated, skeletal, dying, had been left behind when the SS fled days earlier. The prisoners had been worked to death. Literally worked to death. They had been forced to build V-2 rockets in underground tunnels, given barely enough food to maintain minimal function, worked in darkness until they collapsed from exhaustion and malnutrition. Allen ordered all of his troops to enter the camp and witness what they had found. He wanted them to understand what they had been fighting against. He wanted the memories to stay with them forever. The reaction was immediate and devastating. Seasoned soldiers, men who had fought for months without flinching under artillery fire, who had assaulted fortified positions knowing some of them wouldn't return, broke down. Sergeants who had seen men die, who had sent men to probable death, who had organized the killing and the dying and the suffering of combat, stood before rows of emaciated corpses and wept. A medic named Regine Ferris, a man who had treated gunshot wounds and blast injuries and every horror that combat could produce, would later write about his experience. "We were battle-tired and combat-wise," he said. "We thought there was nothing left that we didn't know." Yet in a short period of 2 days, I and many others of the division saw and lived a story we shall never forget. Darkness that Allen had taught his men to master, the darkness they had learned to use as a weapon and a shield, was nothing compared to the darkness they confronted at Nordhausen, the darkness of the human soul, the darkness of industrial-scale murder. The darkness of a system that had calculated 7 to 8 slave laborers per V-2 rocket produced. That meant, from the perspective of Nazi logic, it was acceptable to work 20,000 people to death to produce approximately 2,500 rockets. Allen's night fighters had mastered warfare, but nothing in 35 hours of weekly night training had prepared them for this. They evacuated the survivors for medical treatment. They ordered local German civilians to bury the dead. The division's war had barely 2 weeks left. The Timberwolves pushed east with cold fury. On April 26, 1945, the 104th Division reached the Mulde River. They made contact with Soviet forces advancing from the east. They were among the first American units to link up with the Red Army. The war in Europe was effectively over. Allen's Timberwolves had fought for 195 consecutive days without losing a battle. Part 7. The Vindication. Nearly 5,000 Timberwolves were casualties of the campaign, over 1,000 killed in action. Allen, always the officer who had eaten in the mess lines with his men, who had walked the perimeter wires at night, spent months writing letters to the families of those who had died under his command. Each one was personal. Each one acknowledged the specific sacrifice. Each one came from a general who understood that those deaths, while militarily necessary, were also personally tragic. Omar Bradley never admitted he was wrong about Terry Allen, but George Marshall's judgment had been vindicated in ways that couldn't be disputed. The general who appeared on Time magazine's cover 2 days after being fired had just led his 2nd Division to victory. The troublemaker who had failed out of West Point twice had built the most feared night fighting unit in the European theater. Bradley had said Allen was too much of an individualist for coalition warfare. Allen had proven that individualism wins wars. Bradley had said Allen's approach to leadership was obsolete. Allen had proven it was cutting-edge, innovative, and devastatingly effective. The most striking moment came when Bradley, now commanding the 12th Army Group and touring the front with his staff, encountered Allen in Cologne. After observing the Timberwolves' positions and their discipline, after seeing firsthand the quality of the unit Allen had created, Bradley said something that was almost an apology without quite being one. "Terry, I'm pleasantly surprised to see these young Timberwolves of yours, already ranked along with the 1st and 9th as the finest assault divisions in the European theater," Bradley said. Allen's response was perfect. "Brad, the 1st and 9th are in damned fast company." It was a moment of professional recognition, but it was also something else. It was an acknowledgement of what Allen had accomplished in the face of professional rejection. It was validation that came too late for the men who had died, too late for the months of doubt and uncertainty, but validation nonetheless. The story of Terry Allen is a story about how institutional thinking can be wrong. How a man who seemed unconventional, who violated protocols, who cared more about combat effectiveness than regulation, could be exactly right. It's a story about how military institutions sometimes fail to recognize genius because that genius doesn't fit established patterns. It's also a story about redemption. Allen could have accepted Bradley's firing as final. He could have retreated into bitterness, blamed the system, spent the remaining years of his career in obscure posting. Instead, he took a green division and transformed them into warriors. He proved that his methods, his philosophy, his approach to leadership wasn't a momentary success that couldn't be replicated. It was repeatable. It was teachable. It was more effective than the alternatives. George Marshall had seen something in Terry Allen that others had missed. Marshall understood that you couldn't win wars with officers who worried more about how soldiers looked in formation than how they performed in combat. Marshall understood that sometimes you needed to trust your instinct about a person even when everyone else disagreed. After the war, Allen retired from the Army. He returned to El Paso, Texas, where he had spent time between the wars. He worked as an insurance representative, stayed active in civic and veterans organizations, lived quietly. In 1967, his only son, Terry Allen Jr., was killed in Vietnam while commanding a unit in the same 1st Infantry Division that his father had made famous. The loss devastated Allen. He developed heart problems, suffered a series of small strokes. On September 12, 1969, he died at the age of 81. He was buried at Fort Bliss National Cemetery alongside his son and his wife. The United States Military Academy, the institution that had expelled him twice, now presents the General Terry de la Mesa Allen Award annually to the cadet with the highest rating in military science. It's a modest recognition for a man whose influence on American military history extended far beyond his lifetime. But perhaps the truest measure of Allen's legacy isn't in awards or official recognition. It's in the thousands of men who served under him, who learned that aggressive leadership, combined with genuine care for their welfare, could transform ordinary soldiers into warriors. It's in the understanding, now widely accepted, that military effectiveness can't be measured purely by appearance and protocol. It's in night fighting doctrine, which Allen pioneered, and which remains part of military training to this day. Omar Bradley's decision to fire Terry Allen in August 1943 was made with the best intentions. Bradley believed that military discipline and proper protocol were essential to an effective fighting force. He was right about that. The question wasn't whether discipline mattered. The question was whether discipline should override combat effectiveness. Bradley chose protocol over performance. History and the performance of Allen's 104th Division suggests that was the wrong calculation. But perhaps the most important lesson is the one about second chances. How many times in history has an institution, a person, a system been given an opportunity to correct an injustice and failed to take it? George Marshall took that opportunity. He didn't just give Allen another division. He gave him a platform to prove that Bradley was wrong. And Allen proved it, again and again, night after night, from Oregon to France to Germany to the edge of the Soviet lines. The war was won by millions of soldiers, thousands of officers, dozens of generals all making decisions in circumstances of terrible uncertainty and incomplete information. Some of those decisions were right, some were wrong. Some still generate debate decades later, but one decision stands out as having been clearly vindicated by subsequent events. George Marshall's decision to give Terry Allen a second chance. Allen never publicly criticized Bradley. He never complained about his firing. He simply did what he had always done. He found the challenge in front of him, and he mastered it. He took raw soldiers and turned them into legends. He took a division nobody had heard of and made them famous. He proved that his approach to leadership wasn't a fluke, wasn't dependent on the veteran status of the Big Red One, wasn't something that worked only under specific circumstances. It worked because Allen understood something fundamental about human beings. Under the right leadership, with proper training and clear objectives, ordinary people can accomplish extraordinary things. The salutes don't matter. The uniforms don't matter. What matters is whether the soldiers believe in their commander and whether that commander believes in them. As you continue your journey through the history of World War II, remember Terry Allen. Remember the lessons his life teaches about leadership, about institutional thinking, about the courage it takes to be unconventional in a system that prizes conformity. Remember that sometimes the man who breaks the rules is the man winning the wars. And remember that redemption is possible, even when the circumstances seem most desperate, if you have the character to seize the opportunity. If you enjoyed this story, please like and subscribe to WW2 Tales. We have hundreds more stories of courage, sacrifice, and the complexity of leadership during the greatest conflict in human history. Each week, we bring you the untold stories of the men and women who lived through these extraordinary times. Subscribe now and never miss an episode.